Hello YouTubers out there, this is the Boob Wasteland Show. And now Mr. Booby, what do we have in store today from the world of television? Hello YouTubers, and this is the Boob Wasteland Show with your host Jerry Saravia. So let's talk about Brian Williams. And since this particular show deals with TV shows, or television in general, I also, of course, discuss certain other aspects of television that I'm interested in. So it's not just a review of TV shows or TV movies or whatever, but in general, anything regarding television. So Brian Williams is a hot topic right now. And so what happened with Brian Williams? Well, let's see here. I'm sure most of you know, is the host of NBC Nightly News, which started in December 2nd of 2004. And recently, he had to recant a story that he told about a helicopter that he was in during the Iraq War, specifically on March 24th of 2003. This was really pretty much at the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And that his helicopter was hit by an RPG. Of course, nothing happened to the helicopter outside of just being hit by it. It didn't explode, obviously, but it did crash land. Now, he recanted the story and said, well, he was actually in another helicopter, not in that one. And it was a helicopter that, depending on which account you believe in, arrived either a half hour or an hour later, after the first helicopter that was hit by an RPG. So he recanted this story, but the interesting thing is that during the NBC Nightly News broadcast on January 30th of this year, Williams inaccurately recounted the incident, stating that it was a helicopter he was on that was hit and crippled by enemy fire. So this is really not the first time he's mentioned this story. He's mentioned this story before. In fact, I remember when he was on Letterman mentioning this story. And they ran that clip today on Inside Edition. This is not the first time, but the fact that he mentioned that on NBC Nightly News, for some reason, this caused a furor. Now, as opposed to then. Now, the story was criticized by Lance Reynolds, a flight engineer who was on board of one of the 3 helicopters that had been attacked. Reynolds and the other crew members said they were forced to make an emergency landing, and it was about an hour later that Williams' Chinook helicopter arrived on the scene. And hence you see this footage of Williams, and it looks like he's talking to the crew members, and you see the helicopter that's obviously been punctured, if nothing else, by an RPG. Now, on February 4th, Williams apologized, stating he had made a mistake in recalling the events of 12 years ago. Well, he had been making that mistake forever, because that's the story he kept telling. He was on board the helicopter, and this is a story he stuck to since then. He hasn't really changed the story until recently, in which, of course, he recanted. Now, he apologized to the brave men and women in the air crews who were also in the desert. Now, what's interesting is this has also brought to light the Hurricane Katrina. Brian Williams had an interview with the former Disney CEO Michael Eisner in 2006 concerning Hurricane Katrina, and he claimed back then that he was in a 5-star hotel in the French Quarter and saw a dead body float by his window. He claims the hotel was overrun by a street gang, and that he drank flood water and got dysentery. Now, the New Orleans health officials state that the French Quarter did not get flood water, and they were not aware of anyone getting dysentery during the storm. So, looks like that's yet maybe possibly another lie. Now, the difference is between Brian Williams and, say, someone like Geraldo Rivera, is that Brian Williams has a standard. That standard is, by all accounts, with regards to the news and news corporations alike, the most trusted man in news. That is his status. So this other Katrina story now is receiving more scrutiny, even though it was now 9 years ago. And now the Iraq story, again, it's interesting though that because he mentioned the nightly news, that, stopped the process. Here we go. But he's told the story before. And interestingly enough, Ryan Williams had been renewed for a contract in December for another 5 years, of which he gets $10 million a year for this show, NBC Nightly News. That's neither here or there, but I find that interesting. And then a month later, he decides to tell the story. So I don't know why this wasn't scrutinized more before. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting question because he's mentioned on Letterman. Why didn't that set Twitter aflutter, so to speak? So now it has. Now, what's interesting is I think very few people have done anything other than criticize this man for what he's done, and that maybe he should be fired, because let's remember, this man earned the Peabody Award. Exemplified, as they once put it, the nightly news staff exemplified the highest levels of journalistic excellence in reporting on Hurricane Katrina, for example. He also earned the George Polk Award for the extensive coverage of the hurricane. I mean, he is good. I remember when Princess Di had that accident and, of course, died from it. He was on there hour after hour commenting on it. It was amazing to watch. He is a distinguished news anchor, but that doesn't change the fact that he did lie about something that happened to him that did not happen at all. This is where you cross that ethical line, because this was part of the news story. This is not an incident in high school where he may or may not have smoked pot. He was a news anchor during the Iraq War and certainly prior to that, and this was a news story. I mean, he was there to cover the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and he lied about an RPG hitting his helicopter. This crosses the lines of ethics in news, because news look, when you state what the news is, you're stating it. It's free of any sort of criticism from the news anchor or opinion. It's about stating the facts. And he did not state the facts when it came to something like that. That is really egregious error. So he probably should be fired. And I hate to say that, because this is a man I really do trust. And I mean, it's like he was a new Walter Cronkite. And he screwed up. Now, this brings to mind what happened to Dan Rather back in with the Killian documents controversy. This was back in 2004, 60 Minutes. Supposedly reported on 4 documents that were presented as authentic, and these documents related to George W. Bush's military service with the Texas Army National Guard, and the papers were deemed inauthentic, and Dan Rather and 60 Minutes had that reputation of being scrupulous in their presentation of news and facts, and this was not given enough scrutiny by 60 Minutes before airing, so CBS had failed to authenticate the document. So as a result of all that, Dan Rather was not fired. In fact, the CBS News producer at the time, Mary Mapes, was fired, but Dan Rather basically he resigned, and it was a year before he was supposed to resign. So sometimes these things happen, and this was over an actual news story. And see, with Brian Williams, he was telling this story, this fabrication, on the NBC Nightly News. This was not on Letterman, and even then it would still be an issue, but the fact that he mentions it on the very show in which he's supposed to be the most trusted man in the news world, that is a problem. So yeah, I hate to say it, I like the guy, but yeah, Ryan Williams, he may just have to get axed. But who knows? There's always a spot left for him on Saturday Night Live. So, that's my thought on it. And this is the Boob Wasteland Show with your host, Jerry Saravia, signing off.